Hello, welcome to Logic subscribers and new readers that may be joining us for the first time today. My name is Anita Balakrishnan. I'm a reporter here at The Logic, which is an independent news publication covering Canada's innovation economy. Our subscribers get access to reporting, our daily newsletter, events, community surveys, and Slack channels. This is a special event. This is a launch event of Shift, the free newsletter focused on the transition to electric and autonomous transportation here at The Logic. So to start, please submit any questions you have about our topic today, which is EV affordability, early and often using the button on your screen. We're trying to get to as many as we can today. So we're here to talk about affordability, which seems to be a big question in almost every purchasing decision, especially these days. But of course, vehicle ownership is one of life's biggest expenses for a lot of people. There isn't a lot of perfect data sets out there, but I wanted to pull some facts as a starting point to set the stage for our discussion. Since a lot of our readers are probably doing the math as well on if they can buy an EV anytime soon. So the 2020 median income in Canada after taxes was $66,800. And to put that in perspective, average new vehicle prices were up 17% in May to over $54,000. Used vehicles were nearly $38,000 when that data was pulled in May. So, as we know, vehicles are not an optional expense for many people. A survey of Canadians found that 49% of respondents would have to change jobs if they didn't have a car. So that puts a lot of consumers in a really tough spot between high gas prices and having a car. And inflation had its biggest jump in June since 1983. So EV makers really need to make the case for us to open our wallets right now, especially since Kelley Blue Book data shows average EV prices are almost $20,000 higher than the average new vehicle. So there's a lot to decode today. To help us, we have three great panelists. But first, I want to turn the mic over to our launch sponsor, Scott McKenzie, who's Director of Corporate and External Affairs at Toyota Canada.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here today, both to welcome today's panel and to support the launch of Shift. The decarbonization of transportation is the most vitally important issue our industry has ever faced, and it's a problem Toyota is absolutely committed to helping solve. Not only do the sustainable solutions our industry is working on today represent our future business opportunities, but they'll have an enormous impact on the quality of life of our children and our grandchildren. For this reason, it's more urgent than ever that we have open and honest dialogue about the electrification of transportation. Dialogue that thinks critically and cuts through hype and rhetoric. Dialogue that keeps an open mind when it comes to potential solutions. It's our hope that, starting with today's panel and the regular publication of Shift, The Logic will provide a forum for the critical thinking and open-mindedness on this topic that's so sorely lacking right now. One of Toyota's most important corporate goals is the elimination of carbon, not only from our products, but across all our worldwide operations. Our efforts to reduce carbon emissions started more than 20 years ago with the introduction of the Prius. Since then, we've sold more than 20 million electrified vehicles. In 2015, well before others were focused on electrification, we announced our global Toyota 2050 environmental challenge. In it, along with 5 other specific sustainability goals, Toyota committed to reduce the emissions from the vehicles we sell by 90% by 2050. Over the past few years, we've doubled down on this commitment and accelerated the timeline for many of our sustainability goals. Most importantly, Toyota believes the world needs a range of more sustainable alternatives to traditionally fueled transportation. Why do we need a range of electrified options for consumers? Unfortunately, while many consumers would love to buy one, battery electric vehicles are still beyond the reach of the typical car buyer. The average transaction price of a BEV in Canada is over $60,000, which is significantly more than most consumers can afford. While government incentives can help, even the very generous incentives currently on offer only get us part of the way there. For most everyday consumers, the gap is still too large. The cost will eventually decrease, just as it did with hybrids, But with shortages of the critical minerals required to make batteries, the production of BEVs will continue to be limited and they'll likely become even more expensive before they get cheaper. For this and many other reasons, including woefully inadequate charging infrastructure and persistent consumer anxiety about range and cold weather performance, BEVs simply aren't practical answers for most Canadians yet. And they aren't even a remote possibility for drivers in other parts of the world. So, if most consumers won't be buying a BEV in the very near future, we urgently need other solutions to play a role in bringing down our overall greenhouse gas emissions today. Like other automakers, Toyota is innovating to make zero emission vehicles better and more affordable for the average consumer. In the meantime, we're offering drivers a range of electrified options that meet their needs and help them reduce their carbon emissions right now. Having low emission vehicles, hybrid electric, plug in hybrid electric, fuel cell electric, and now battery electric across our lineup allows our customers to choose a more sustainable vehicle that meets their needs at a price point that's accessible to them. And it's an approach that's working. Toyota still sells more electrified vehicles to Canadians than any other automaker. Last year, Toyota Canada sold more than 60,000 electrified vehicles. Last month, electrified vehicles represented 28% of our overall sales. That's important because every hybrid electric we sell delivers around 40% fewer carbon emissions, and every plug-in hybrid electric vehicle reduces carbon emissions even further. In other words, until most people can afford battery electric vehicles, the more customers who choose other electrified options instead of simply continuing to drive the older internal combustion vehicle they have now, or even buying a new ICE vehicle, the more meaningful the combined carbon reduction will have as an industry. I look forward to hearing today's panel discuss the possible solutions to the many challenges facing the decarbonization of transportation in Canada. And I hope today's discussion will help launch what will be an important and ongoing critical analysis of this urgent issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. I'm excited to get into the panel today and introduce our audience to the panelists. Again, there should be a button, I think it's on the lower right of your screen, where you can submit a question. We're going to try to get to a lot today. I think we're set for a lively discussion. So I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. Our first panelist is David Adams, President of Global Automakers of Canada. He has 35 years of experience in the Canadian auto industry. He's served in executive roles in both of Canada's top automotive industry associations, and he's an avid cyclist. Our second panelist is Brendan Sweeney, Managing Director of Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing. Before his current role, he was Research Director in the Automotive Policy Research Center at McMaster. He holds a PhD in Geography from Queen's and a Bachelor in Labor Studies from McMaster. And our third panelist is Rebecca Young, Vice President and Head of Inclusion and Resilience Economics at Scotiabank. She provides thought leadership on inclusive economic growth, ensuring that higher productivity gains translate into broad improvements in well-being across society. She holds a bachelor's in chemical engineering from McGill, Master of Science in Environmental Policy from the London School of Economics, and an MBA from INSEAD. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello. We'll get into audience questions in just a second. But first, I kind of want to set the stage to kind of bring us all into the same page of what the problems are with affordability that we're trying to tackle right now. And since you all have sort of come from different areas of the sector, whether it's the high level of the economy or the pipeline from manufacturer to dealership or really in the plants, I know you all have sort of different views on what's going on right now. So I was wondering if we could go around and kind of establish what some of the factors are that make electric vehicles more expensive than internal combustion vehicles right now, and whether it's how they're made or supply and demand. So maybe we could start with David.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for launching the shift. I think that's going to be a real useful newsletter for a number of us that are continuing to monitor how we make this transition. But to your point, in terms of what makes electric vehicles more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles at the moment, it's there's a couple of things. One is scale, and principally right now we're we're talking about the batteries that drive the vehicles, the electric vehicles. Batteries are currently more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles, their engines and their transmissions, and that's resulting in electric vehicle prices being substantially higher than ICE vehicle prices. Those prices will come down eventually, but right now we're actually seeing a spike in battery prices due to what we've all seen in the news in terms of battery plant announcements, vehicle manufacturers trying to lock down battery supply, battery component supply and whatnot. So again, the demand for the battery components is chasing the supply, which is driving up the cost of those components. But we are anticipating over time that the cost of batteries will come down. And when you get to about the 100 kilowatt hour point, or $100 per kilowatt hour price point, then you have price parity, or roughly price parity with an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Yeah, so Brendan, since we've talked a little bit about batteries, I know there are some other challenges getting to that manufacturing scale right now with EVs. Maybe you can expand a little bit on sort of what some of the manufacturing holdups we're seeing right now are to getting to that wide scale.
Sure. I mean, I think we've got to recognize that we very successfully built and rebuilt an internal combustion engine vehicle supply chain globally over decades upon decades upon decades. And that required us to get a number of nodes in the supply chain up to scale to achieve the efficiencies, the economies of scale necessary to make these vehicles affordable for people. We're barely a decade in to building this electric vehicle supply chain, and we've got a long way to go. We're making some significant progress. We're making some big strides, but some of the whether it's bringing mines online in democratically governed countries to supply the battery plants, or to supply battery materials plants, to supply battery plants, to supply assembly plants. This is not going to happen overnight. This is going to require a ton of investment. And I think we know that, and it's going to require that we do this at multiple nodes of the supply chain. So it's not just a matter of Toyota investing in its assembly plants. It's a matter of Toyota doing that, and then the battery manufacturers doing that, and then the battery materials manufacturers, who are chemical and metal processors, doing that, and then mining companies investing in new mines. This is not a 2 or 3 year thing. This is a 1 or 2 or 3 decade thing before we can really achieve the economies of scale necessary. And the right supply chains, not just supply chains, but the right supply chains. In my opinion, it would be great if there was more of a focus on the mining and materials side in democratically governed countries like Canada. And let's just call it 10 plus years out before we hit those economies.
So I know we've talked in the past about sort of there being a sweet spot in the plant where if you're making sort of less than a couple 100,000 vehicles, it's not running at full capacity. You're investing all of this in the capital, but you're not necessarily getting full output. And I know we've been trying to get inventories of vehicles in general up. There's been a microchip shortage. We are also seeing interest rates going up, which I think maybe could have an impact on demand. I'm not the expert, but Rebecca's the expert. What are we seeing, I guess, in the economy right now that's impacting the ability for consumers to buy the vehicles that they want right now?
Well, I think that the best way to paraphrase really is that everything is more expensive right now, and everything is likely to remain quite expensive over the next couple of quarters, if not years. And so we all know inflation, for example, was up over 8% last month, and it's expected to have a few more high prints before it starts coming down. And so, but that's really the symptom. And we know that the pandemic distorted lots in the economy. It distorted not only how we live, but how we purchase. We purchased a lot more in durables, including cars, and then we had supply chains bungled. But inflation's a symptom. The causes are far more complex. And now we're even having these expectations. People are expecting prices to go up. But a lot, as you cited some of the statistics, the motor vehicles are, these factors are really concentrated. So we're seeing vehicle pricing higher than headline inflation. So the average buyer that's looking for a vehicle now is looking at prices that are up somewhere, 20, 25% relative to pre-pandemic. And then you layer on the cost of financing because interest rates are going up, probably an equal portion of spending is going on that interest cost plus the new vehicle cost. And then you layer on the cost of vehicles, so driving that vehicle. So the consumer right now is faced with a whole slew of cost pressures. And that's not even getting into talking about what they're spending on housing or what they're spending on food. So I think we're in this kind of transition right now where we had, reopenings, rebounds, lots of optimism. And then we had these geopolitical events that exacerbated already, elevated inflation. So we're going to have a period of anxiety where people are actually kind of worried about a recession and what that means for demand. Now, I would say, there is quite a bit of pent up demand because people couldn't buy vehicles during, most of the pandemic, and they still can't buy vehicles. And that's been one of the factors also pushing up some of the prices. But no doubt we have a couple months, if not quarters, of uncertainty as the Bank of Canada is going to keep raising its interest rates. So the average consumer is going to keep facing these headwinds. And I guess just one final, point I would mention relating to vehicle pricing that we've seen is because of the chip shortage and more generally, inventory shortage in vehicle production is that we saw a prioritization of higher end vehicles, so higher priced vehicles, including in the EV space. So that's distorted the picture as well. And when you think about affordability, those vehicles that were, more affordable were not being built. So, maybe there is a bit of a silver lining is that as supply chains work themselves out, some of that temporary factor should improve, that we'll have, not only more, production online, but also newer models coming online that are more affordable.
Yeah, maybe if I can just pivot off of something that Rebecca said there, because I think it's important to, when you look at the chip shortage that the industry's incurred, generally, I think manufacturers have made that shift that Rebecca suggested, prioritizing chips for vehicles where manufacturers can actually make the most money on, frankly. And I think, that's another whole issue that is very important in this transition as well to electrification that, might be easy or easier, I should say, for perhaps startups to come to market, backed by, I guess investors. But I think for the incumbent manufacturers, it's much more difficult to make that transition and to figure out, how much should I devote to electrified vehicles? How much should I devote to ICE vehicles? I mean, the governments around the world have given fairly clear direction in terms of where they want the sales targets to be by such and such a time. Whether or not those targets are realistic, I think remains to be seen. I think from our perspective, the jury is still out on that. But so much of it comes down to the ability of industry to transition. And secondly, I think to what Brendan was referring to a little bit is the ability of consumers to make that switch as well, and the desire to make that switch.
So when we're talking about mandates, we know that the government of Canada has said they want all new vehicle sales to be electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles by 2035. Obviously, there will still be the existing cars that are sold today will still be on the road. But it's hard to imagine. And as we've just discussed, for some people being able to buy that electric vehicle in the next few years. So I'm curious if we could all kind of weigh in on a step that institutions can take, whether that's government, automakers, lenders, a combination. What are the levers that we're going to need to pull to bring EV prices closer to price parity with internal combustion vehicles? Yeah, maybe we can start with Brendan and the manufacturing side and then flow up to the rest of the economy.
Sure. So on one side of affordability, I think we often forget that if people made more money, if we had more wealth and prosperity, things could potentially be more affordable. So if the median income goes from $66,000 to $96,000, all of a sudden a certain tranche of that vehicle market becomes more affordable to the average person if the average person makes $30,000 more a year. Easier said than done, but I don't think we should lose track of that. Now, on the manufacturing side and on the industry side, I suppose, let's start really focusing on getting the start of the supply chain online, where a lot of the real bottlenecks are going to be. If we don't have the minerals and the metals that we need that are in the ground today, out of the ground and into factories, we're not going to have battery materials. And so I think it's really, really important to recognize that some of the timelines with bringing these mines online are several years out. Let's focus on, I've got a couple that are kind of the top of mind, but let's focus on bringing some of these mines online and then creating a system where we send or where we commit those Canadian mine minerals to Canadian battery materials plants. The economic benefits will be in multiples if we can do that. And then from Canada, we can supply materials to battery manufacturers throughout North America, throughout EU, while increasing wealth and prosperity at the same time as a pan-Canadian exercise rather than, an Ontario, Montreal, Winnipeg exercise.
So we've got chasing economic opportunities, bringing down mineral prices and bringing up mineral supplies as a way to sort of flood into the vehicle market. I guess going over to Dave, how do you see, I guess, another step that could be taken to bring down the prices or even out the prices?
Well, I think one of the things that is already occurring, and I think it's open to question whether or not that the amount is sufficient enough, is the incentives that both the federal government have provided and provincial governments are providing. In some cases it's substantial. I think if you look at the federal incentive combined with the provincial incentive in Quebec, it equates to about $14,000, I believe, $13,000. But across the board, there's a maximum $5,000 federal incentive for folks that are looking to purchase EVs. Is that enough? Probably not. When I think Scott outlined in his opening remarks that the gap can be as high as $20,000+ between a nice vehicle and a ZEV. Yes, there are some ZEVs where that gap is not quite as wide, but if you look at it on average, you're probably looking at sort of tens of thousands of dollars. So it's a help, but it's not going to quite close the gap. So certainly incentives would be of assistance in terms of motivating people to make that purchase, make that step. I think other tools that I know different manufacturers have used have been things like free charging for a certain period of time after you purchase your vehicle. One of the challenges that it is for all consumers and for, I think, manufacturers trying to sell EVs is, advocates out there would say, oh, well, if people look at the long-term cost of owning the vehicle, they're going to save lots of money over the ownership cycle. But, most people don't buy cars that way. And that's part of the education and transition process we need to go through. So people generally have, call it $500, $600, $700 a month that they want to spend on a car payment. They're not necessarily going to say, well, I'm prepared to spend $900 more a month to save, $20,000, $30,000 over the 15 years that I'm going to own my car. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I think there are other things that can be utilized to make things more affordable. We see some of it in terms of, being able to use high occupancy vehicle lanes. For instance, there's a value associated with that if your time is important to you and you're trying to get places. So there are other tools like that can be utilized and brought to bear to look at the whole affordability question, I think.
So we'll definitely come back to incentives. I see some questions in the chat about incentives and subsidies. But Rebecca, before we move on to that, or if you have any comments on that, are there any more steps that you think need to be taken before 2035 to help even out the costs between electric vehicles?
Yes, I'll comment on a few things that my colleagues have said. And so, first of all, let's be frank that the incentives, the size of incentives we're talking about, have more or less been eroded by price inflation and legitimate price inflation. Yeah. And so, after a couple of years of battery costs coming down, in the double digits, what we are likely to see is battery costs going up probably in the order of 15%. So more or less, and that's just the battery costs. It's not like the labor costs, because we know wages have been going up and other materials. So, that subsidy or that incentive has essentially been wiped out and then some. And so we need it, and we probably need more of it. But I would also caution that there's no panacea, that it's going to take like the whole slew of toolkit. That, to be fair, the governments are, attempting to address a whole range of issues. And just to pick on a few, the mandate, I know there are some questions. What is the mandate? Does it need to be delayed? Does it need to be adjusted? Basically, if you think it's all about supply and demand in terms of a pricing environment, well, if manufacturers can't produce enough vehicles to meet those mandates, and what we're seeing is shortages are even more acute in the EV space than they are in ICE engines right now. So we know there's a big shortage. Are we going to be able to, create enough vehicles that, that people can buy? And if we always have more buyers than vehicles, well, we're going to have an even more difficult, pricing environment, and it's going to be less affordable. So I would say you need to calibrate it. So, that's going to require close collaboration with manufacturers. Just two other points. One would be around obviously charging infrastructure, but also sorry, I lost that. The across the country electrifying or greening the electricity grid, that there are still provinces where you buy an electric vehicle and you plug it into a fossil fueled electric system. So, if the federal government is really thinking about meeting its targets, it definitely has to address that and think about where, that's another part of the solution. And my final point really would be on price parity shouldn't be that far off in some regards if you look at China. So before the latest price developments, price parity was only, an EV was only about 10% more than a traditional engine in China, but the vehicles are way smaller, and it's just a different culture, a different attitude to, what is an appropriate size vehicle. So I think we do need that mind shift, and that was brought up earlier about how do we get people into smaller vehicles and hence more affordable price points.
So before we move on from the incentives issue, and I see a question from the audience here about whether the EV market should be heavily subsidized. So we know there's subsidies going at different levels, whether that's manufacturers, whether that's incentives. I know, Brendan, you have had some opinions on that in the past. I don't know if you had any follow-up conversation on that, or whether the points you wanted to make have been made.
Sure. I've got a bit of an alternative perspective on the incentives and consumer subsidies, and I would agree that they are moderately effective at getting more EVs on the road in the jurisdiction in which the subsidy is offered. They're going to go on the road somewhere, right? The demand is so high. So we're kind of moving things around. What they don't do is they don't make them any more affordable. They are displacing the cost that an individual consumer gets a benefit, and the broader citizenry provides that benefit. And maybe that's okay. But it does not make the vehicle itself any more affordable. And it's really going to take, I don't see too many other solutions to actually make the vehicle more affordable than, on the one hand, prosperity, and there's a lot of ways to achieve that. But on the other hand, developing over time in steps and increments of full scale EV battery supply chain, EV supply chain, in which efficiencies are realized at every node in the supply chain.
If I can just comment on, Brendan sort of made the link there between mandates and incentives a little bit as well. And I think that's an important one, because I think folks that say, oh, well, we absolutely need a mandate because that's the only way we're going to get any vehicles. And it ties into a point that Rebecca made earlier as well, is that, I think people need to be realistic that if you have automakers around the world that have a limited supply of electrified vehicles, they're going to respond to a few things. One, obviously, is the regulatory regimes into which the countries in which they're selling those vehicles. And the other, I think, ultimately that people forget is profitability, or at least not losing any more money than you're already losing. And I think the reality is that folks sometimes forget that Canada is a very if you want to call it in the automotive industry, it's a low margin kind of market to say that. So I think it's very simplistic to say, oh, if we have mandates, we'll get the vehicles. Well, you may and you may not, because ultimately folks at headquarters are making the decision, well, okay, there's a ZEV mandate, but I can make more money on vehicles in another part of the world, and I'm prepared to trade that off for perhaps having to pay penalties. I mean, every automaker wants to comply with the regulatory regimes that are in place. But I mean, it's a much bigger picture that has to be considered. And I think the other thing that, kind of frosts me a little bit at times is people will say, oh, well, if you look at jurisdictions, Quebec and BC and Canada, well, the only reasons that they have the uptake that they do is because of the mandates. Well, Quebec has had a mandate in place longer than BC has, but BC has a higher penetration of zero emission vehicles. So it's not as simplistic as that. And I think I would suggest that the reason that, both those jurisdictions have high penetration rates is not so much the mandates, it's a combination of the other policy levers that have been put in place. Rebecca talked and Brendan talked about infrastructure, absolute necessity. Having a provincial incentive in place, probably an absolute necessity. Combine that with the federal, infrastructure, and also combine it with, perhaps it's an education piece, but a predisposition of the populace to think a little bit more environmentally or green, if you will.
I see some audience questions that dovetail nicely here. So one of the things that we hear a lot is, and that you mentioned, Dave, is that EVs can be less expensive in the long run, but a lot of people get that sticker shock at the beginning. And I have a question here from Richard about how the maintenance and upkeep costs of an EV compare to internal combustion engines. So I'm kind of curious where that idea comes from of that lowering costs over time, and how the maintenance plays into that. I don't know, maybe Brendan might have some thoughts on that, but I thought maybe Dave could to take a stab at it.
Sure. Well, I'll start and happy to hand it over to others. Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at an electric vehicle, a pure battery electric vehicle, as opposed to a plug-in hybrid vehicle, and I think sometimes folks don't necessarily understand the difference between the technologies. So when you talk about a battery, a BEV, a battery electric vehicle that has just a battery, FEV, which is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, has an internal combustion engine and a battery that will potentially drive that vehicle, call it 30 to 80 kilometers on electric mode before it switches over to the engine. But certainly for a pure battery electric vehicle, the maintenance costs probably will be lower because you don't have an engine, you don't have a transmission, there's much fewer moving parts. But I think you have to offset that with the fact that there's a lot more digitization and computerization in an EV than there would be for instance, in an ICE vehicle. So, I think we're all sort of in the automotive world dealing with the challenges of, transitioning our vehicles, whether it's internal combustion engine vehicle or a ZEV, from a mechanical device into, as people have called it, computer on wheels sort of thing. So, but certainly the maintenance costs will be lower on an EV, a pure battery electric vehicle. And I think that's sort of a key selling point for them going forward.
So I think another factor that people often think of is the charging cost, especially with gas prices being very high right now. Rebecca, you had mentioned the improvements that need to be made to the grid. And I know someone had mentioned, maybe it was Scott, the inadequate charging infrastructure. So I'm wondering for Rebecca, what kinds of changes need to be made to make sure that that more affordable charging options are cleaner and more affordable charging options are available to more drivers as we get closer to 2035?
Well, I think, and the answer, in terms of greening the grid is province by province, because we do have such, dramatic differences. And so we saw, for example, the federal government make an announcement for out east in Nova Scotia, where I am presently, which, 75% of its energy is coming from fossil fuels. So they're looking at renewables. And so, I think, there are kind of like laundry lists of, measures that the government is or can take in that sense. I would add, though, a perspective on the question of should the government subsidize or not. If you look at it, and I'm not going to take a side on it, I'm going to provide one angle of looking at it, which is that 25% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, or about a quarter, come from transportation, from driving. So if you look at it from the perspective of Canada wanting to meet its net zero targets, there is a public interest in getting more Canadians into EVs and making sure that they're charging, from clean energy sources. So if you flip the argument on that side, it's how much should they be willing to pay to get consumers into those vehicles, and how much should they be willing to subsidize temporarily the industry to get up to scale and to bring R&D down. So there's definitely an argument that there is a at the upstart or the beginning of kind of that innovation space, there is a role for public dollars to get us there. What you don't want, though, is that scenario which Brendan talked about, is that you just get an ongoing subsidy and you don't get prices coming down. So you do want to strike that balance. But I wouldn't disagree also that you need, just, higher incomes, but I don't think we're there yet. So we need to, bring down the costs. And I think there was a question, I know I'm not supposed to read the questions, but a question about alternative battery technologies. And yes, there definitely, there's work going on out there in terms of, batteries that don't require lithium, for example, or, these smaller batteries for smaller vehicles, which I mentioned. So there's, real space for innovation there. And I would say, hopefully policymakers and society in general have reflected on geopolitical developments that were touched on earlier, which is that both the mining of these rare earths and critical minerals are concentrated in a subset of countries, many of which are really weakly governed, but also the supply chains. For example, like 3/4 of batteries produced in the world are in China alone, and we know what happens when you get market concentration in supply chains like that. So we need both that innovation and bringing the technologies down and alternative technologies, because we are going to be beholden to a few countries with vast reserves of these critical resources, and we can't always rely on on them being willing and friendly partners.
Yeah, that's a great point on the batteries. I know a lot of Tesla super fans will know that Tesla is focusing more on iron phosphate batteries, which are more popular in China. And I guess the traditional complaint about those has been that they're lower range. I know we have a question here. Are manufacturers maybe focusing too much on these expensive batteries with really high ranges when many people don't drive that far every day? I guess, yeah, does anyone on the manufacturing side want to discuss sort of why there is that drive to increase the range on electric vehicles?
Sure. This is my non-engineering opinion, that one, there's a certain class of consumer that wants certain performance, certain range out of their battery, and to have a vehicle, just like you wouldn't have a vehicle with a gas tank that only gets you 100 kilometers. You don't want a battery that only gets you 100 kilometers, but there are some for whom that is perfectly appropriate. But there is, that one time where you need that vehicle because you've got to drive from Toronto to Ottawa or Toronto to Windsor, or you've got to drive to the cottage, or you've got to drive to Buffalo. You if the car isn't sufficient, it's not sufficient. You're not going to buy it. When it comes to the technologies, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, we're going to see different battery technologies, and some of them will just be different, right? Just like we see different fuel technologies, whether it's petroleum or diesel, or I hope I made that distinct, gasoline or diesel. I hope I made that distinction. Propane, natural gas. So there will be different technologies that emerge. There will be some that are dominant for whatever reason. And that in 50, 60, 70 years, we might be looking for a completely different solution to this too. So these technologies will evolve over time, and we will start to see 4 or 5 different kind of classes of battery within 10 years in the market. So
there's lots of different battery chemistries, on the market already. And to your point, Anita, I mean, you look at China, some of the reason, as Rebecca alluded to, that the vehicles are relatively inexpensive is because they're using that less expensive battery technology in the vehicle. So smaller batteries, less expensive battery technology gives you a price point that's maybe a little bit more accommodating. I think, at the end of the day, though, the real issue, tying a few things together, talk about public investment. Public investment has been needed. We saw the announcements earlier this year that were made, and I guess tail end of 2020 as well, in terms of the Detroit 3 manufacturers, contributions by both governments to work to get their plants electrified. Also announcement and with Honda to Honda's going to put $1.4 billion into their plant to produce hybrid electric vehicles. Unless you have the manufacturing facilities, the vehicle assembly facilities, it's not all that likely you're going to get a whole lot of the supply chain building up around that. So I think it's critical. Those public investments are critical to assist in keeping those mandates going out into the future. And those then become the basis for building out the new supply chain that Brendan talked about at the outset of the talk here. Because without those things, we might get some benefit in terms of the battery components and batteries and that sort of thing. But all batteries are huge and they're expensive, or they're heavy, and they need to be fairly close to where they're actually being put in the vehicle.
So we only have a few minutes left. So I know the reality for a lot of people in Canada is that they need a car to get around because that's the way the area that they live in was built. But obviously, even those of us who cannot afford to buy an EV today can still do other things to make greener choices and find more affordable ways to participate in this transition. So I'm curious if everyone could kind of also weigh in quickly on just ways to support affordable and sustainable transportation beyond just car ownership in Canada.
Well, maybe I'll kick it off. I mean, I think
Go ahead.
if we just look at the EV, and it goes back to something that Brendan said a few minutes ago. I mean, being in the auto industry, maybe I shouldn't say this, but presumably if the government wants us to have transportation, they probably only want a family to own one car, not 2 or 3 or 4. And I think to Brendan's point, if you're only going to own one car, you want that car to be versatile. And Canadians are not going to purchase battery electric vehicles until they can meet all of their needs in the same way that their ICE vehicle did. So when we talk about range, the range needs to be able to accommodate that battery range trip up to the cottage, or at least some place to charge that vehicle very quickly on the way up to the cottage if they don't have the range. Infrastructure, we didn't get into that too much, but it's abysmal in Canada. It needs to be built out very quickly. I think, the other reality is that, we need for consumers to really adopt the technology, the incentive, the infrastructure, and more education, I think, as well is important. because there's still a lot of people that don't understand the differences between the technology. And I think going back to Scott's original point in his overview is if the government is focused on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, that should be the goal. And I think as manufacturers, we've always said, set a target for GHG emissions reduction, don't specify how we're going to do that. And I think the challenge with battery electric technology is the government's basically settled on one technology, and that technology is good, but it might not necessarily provide the full GHG benefit that could be accrued by looking at other technologies as well.
Maybe Brendan, and then we could close with Rebecca.
Sure. One comment on mandates and one comment on sustainable transportation. Are we gonna make this mandate in 2035? Probably not. But you know what? If I came home with a report card and it had an 84 on it and we got 84% of the way there, yeah, I don't know, I'd get $20 or something, right? So maybe having a lofty and ambitious target isn't a bad thing, as long as we know that it's a target, that it's something we're aspiring to. So in that respect, if this is where we want to go, I got nothing wrong with a lofty target. When it comes to
well, except I would argue, Brennan, except that if it's a mandated target and there are penalties associated with it, then having a lofty target is a challenge. But
I'll give you that. Yeah. So yeah. When it comes to the sustainable transportation and other alternatives, I think we have to recognize, I grew up with the 501 streetcar on Queen Street East as background noise, like literally sharing a window with it, maybe 3 stories up though. But there's a real stigma developing around public transportation these days. And especially if you're just kind of outside of Toronto, in mid-size and smaller Ontario municipalities is what I can refer to. And there's a stigma about who uses public transportation. And we built some of that public transportation, those buses, those streetcars in Canada. Much of that is or can be electrified. And so maybe there are opportunities to build that infrastructure, to build those vehicles, add to that wealth and prosperity as part of this overall transition to electric vehicles. But if no one's going to use them because there's a stigma associated with it, that's going to be very challenging. So to eliminate, to reduce that stigma, again, easier said than done. But I think that would be one, and I'm kind of taking my manufacturing, but that would be one element of sustainable transportation over time.
Yeah, I would. I will pick up on those same points, but I think we need to rethink. People aren't buying a vehicle, they aren't buying a battery, they aren't buying the metal, they're buying a service. So how do you think about it in that term? And that's what we saw with the the rollout of ride sharing and car sharing. And so we're probably needing to think more out of the box, particularly when we see the younger generation that car ownership just isn't as high, so they're looking for something different. And to give an example, to what extent is this idea that battery technology is going to advance so rapidly? Why would you buy this year? Because next year it might not be worth that much and technology will have moved on. So if manufacturers are thinking, how do you actually update your computer on wheels next year and not require a whole new vehicle? Relatedly though, bringing down the cost is also getting a second-hand market, a used car market for EVs more robust, and that'll come with time. It'll depend on how many new purchases are made now and when they're retired to used market, and that can include some of the fleet that Brendan mentioned. The final point, though, I'd make, though, is that we have to get out, stop the navel gazing and think like this is Canada versus the US. Like, we're way behind China and we're way behind Europe. And so manufacturers, whether they're positioned in Canada or the US or Mexico, we have to catch up with the vehicle developments that are happening in other continents and the price points that are coming down far more rapidly, because we'll increasingly see more of those displacing vehicles produced here if we don't bring down prices quickly.
Okay, we could probably talk for hours about this, but I think we have to leave it there. I want to share just a couple resources with our audience who are curious about learning more. Clean Energy Canada has a pretty recent report called The True Cost, which looks at a lot of different models and the cost over time of ownership of EVs versus internal combustion. BC Hydro also has a cost calculator on their website. thanks again to our panelists and sponsor for joining us and having such a lively discussion and being willing to jump in. We got to a lot of questions, not all of them, but you guys were very dynamic, so I really appreciate it. Subscribers, also, thank you so much for joining. Subscriber support means a lot. It funds so much of our journalism. And so we really appreciate your support. And I want to also thank the Logix business team and Ariel, our partnership manager, for setting up this event. So yeah, thanks again to our speakers and our audience, and we'll see you next time.